Catherine's portrait contains a crown that was never hers to wear. The palace is now consumed by a war nobody saw coming. Was this an accident or a deliberate action? The portrait that stopped the palace cold. Behind the carefully maintained walls of Buckingham Palace, there is an unspoken rule that every senior royal understands. Appearances matter, images carry power, and the wrong symbol, displayed at the wrong moment, can ignite a firestorm that no press secretary can contain. That is exactly what happened when Catherine, Princess of Wales, unveiled her most recent official portrait in early 2025. And the fallout inside the palace has not stopped since. The portrait was commissioned as part of a broader effort to mark Catherine's return to public life, following her cancer diagnosis and the treatment that kept her away from royal duties for months. On the surface, it looked like a moment of quiet triumph, a princess reclaiming her place, a woman who had faced something devastating and chosen to step back into the light with her head held high. The painting itself was immediately striking. Catherine was depicted with a composed, almost regal stillness that drew instant comparisons to the most celebrated royal portraits in British history. People who saw it used words like timeless and commanding. Art critics noted the deliberate classical composition. Royal watchers noted something else entirely. But it was not her expression that started the war. It was not the gown she wore or the setting chosen by the artist. It was what was resting within the composition near her, a crown. Not a decorative flourish. Not a casual artistic addition. A crown that, according to royal insiders and historians who spoke to various outlets in the days following the portrait's release, carries symbolic weight inside the palace that most ordinary viewers would never fully appreciate. For the general public scrolling through their phones and pausing to admire the image, the crown looked like a beautiful and fitting detail for a princess. For those inside the institution who understand what royal symbols mean and why they are chosen, it reads as something far more deliberate and far more loaded. Within hours of the portrait becoming public, the conversation exploded. Social media was filled with admiration and analysis in equal measure. Commentators and historians were invited onto television programs to discuss the imagery. Royal watchers began pulling apart every detail of the composition. And somewhere inside the palace, in rooms far removed from the public discussion playing out on screens and timelines, the reaction was reportedly more intense than anything visible from the outside. Because while the public was celebrating the image, certain senior royals were not celebrating at all. They were asking questions, pointed questions, the kind that only get asked when something has gone wrong at a level that affects the entire institution. Sources close to the palace suggest the portrait was not reviewed and approved by all relevant parties before it was released to the public. That single detail, if accurate, raised immediate and serious concerns among those who understand how these things are supposed to work. How does an official royal portrait, one loaded with the kind of visual symbolism that shapes public perception of the monarchy itself, move from artist studio to global release without the broad consultation that palace protocol has always required? Was it a genuine oversight somewhere in the approval chain? Or was it something considerably more intentional than anyone in Catherine's circle was prepared to admit openly? Those two possibilities sat at the center of every private conversation that followed inside the palace. And depending on which answer you believed, the implications pointed in very different directions. For those who believed it was an accident, the conversation was about process and tightening approvals. For those who believed it was deliberate, the conversation was about something much bigger, about power, about timing, and about a message that had been sent clearly enough that pretending it had not been sent was no longer a credible option for anyone paying attention. Those who know how the royal institution operates from the inside will tell you with great consistency that nothing in that world happens without intention. Every detail of an official portrait, from the angle of the subject's posture to the specific jewelry chosen to the objects deliberately placed within the frame, is the product of consultation, discussion, and approval at multiple levels. Artists receive detailed briefs. Household advisors review compositions. Communications teams consider how every element will be interpreted by the public and the press before a single image is released. So when a crown of this particular significance appeared in Catherine's portrait, the suggestion that nobody in the chain of approval noticed or considered its meaning stretches credibility far beyond the breaking point. Royal historians who spoke publicly following the portrait's release were quick to note that the crown featured Carrie's associations that reach well beyond Catherine herself as an individual. It speaks to succession. It speaks to precedence. It speaks to the question of who holds the real symbolic center of the monarchy in the public imagination. And for one specific senior royal, those associations did not land as a pleasant reminder of the natural order of things. They landed as a challenge, direct, visual, and impossible to misread. A challenge she had absolutely no intention of absorbing quietly. But to understand the full force of that reaction, and why this particular symbol in this particular portrait triggered something this significant, you have to revisit the long and painful road that brought that senior royal to where she stands today. Because the wound this portrait reopened did not begin in 2025. It began more than 4 decades earlier. Camilla's crown and the wound that never healed. To understand why Catherine's portrait sent Camilla into what multiple insiders are now describing as a state of barely contained fury, travel back in time, not a few years, much further. Back to a period when the very idea of Camilla Parker Bowles, one day wearing a crown and sitting beside a king as his queen consort, would have struck most observers of the British royal family as not just unlikely, but genuinely unthinkable. When King Charles, then the Prince of Wales, married Lady Diana Spencer in July of 1981, the ceremony was watched by an estimated 750 million people around the world. Millions lined the streets of London. The occasion was described in the press as the wedding of the century, a fairy tale made real, a shy young nursery teacher transformed into a princess in front of a watching world. But behind the pageantry and the global celebration, the foundation of that marriage was already deeply compromised, and the reason, as history would eventually make impossible to deny, had a name that the palace would spend years refusing to say publicly. Charles and Camilla had shared a powerful personal connection long before Diana entered the picture. They had moved in the same aristocratic social circles. They had been close in ways that went beyond ordinary friendship. And when circumstances and timing and the pressure of royal duty pulled them apart, without allowing that connection to find its natural resolution, the feeling between them did not disappear. It went underground. It survived the wedding. It survived the early years of the marriage. It survived the public denials and the carefully managed appearances of a family united. And when the marriage finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, the connection between Charles and Camilla was still there, intact and undeniable. When Diana died in Paris in August of 1997, the grief that swept through Britain was unlike anything the country had experienced in living memory. The outpouring was raw and enormous and sustained. The royal family's initial response to her death was widely criticized as distant and inadequate. Public anger in those early days found targets easily, and Camilla, in the eyes of a grieving public that had loved Diana with fierce loyalty, was not someone who could expect warmth or forgiveness anywhere in the near future. The years that followed required her to absorb that hostility quietly, while the path toward a more open future slowly and painfully cleared. They married in April of 2005, a quiet civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel. Surveys at the time showed significant public disapproval. The memory of Diana remained powerful and protective in the hearts of a large portion of the British population. Camilla understood the position she was in, and she played the long game with considerable discipline. She chose her causes carefully. She kept her public profile measured and consistent. She let years of steady, unshowy service do the work that argument and explanation never could. And slowly, incrementally, the public perception of her began to shift. By September of 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died and Charles became king, Camilla had spent nearly 2 decades in the patient work of rehabilitation. The late Queen herself had made her wishes clear, publicly expressing her desire that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when the time came. And in May of 2023, at the coronation held at Westminster Abbey, that moment arrived. Camilla was crowned. She wore a modified crown in a ceremony watched by millions. She sat beside her husband as his queen. And for a woman who had spent the better part of 20 years being cast as a villain in one of the most public love stories of the modern era, that crown meant something that went far beyond ceremony or protocol. It was proof. It was the tangible, irreversible confirmation that the journey from the most reviled woman in Britain to crowned queen had reached its destination. It was the closing of a chapter that had cost her more than most people who criticized her ever paused to consider. That crown was everything. And now, in early 2025, a portrait had appeared that seemed to say, with quiet but unmistakable clarity, that another crown was already waiting, already being claimed in the public imagination, already being positioned as the crown that the nation was truly excited about. And the woman who had fought so hard for hers was not prepared to receive that message in silence. The fury behind closed doors. Royal households run on discretion. The staff who move through those corridors are selected in part for their ability to witness things and register nothing, to hear conversations and retain no memory of them, to observe tension between powerful people and give no outward sign that they have noticed anything at all. It is a professional culture built on the understanding that what happens inside those walls stays inside those walls. But when emotions reach a certain intensity and when the stakes become personal enough, even the most disciplined environment begins to leak. And according to sources who spoke to royal correspondents in the weeks following Catherine's portrait release, what leaked from Camilla's household was significant. Multiple insiders have described her reaction as among the most visible expressions of displeasure the Queen Consort has shown in recent memory. One source, speaking anonymously, described the atmosphere within her household in the days after the portrait went public as noticeably heavy. Staff moved carefully. Conversations were kept short. The change in atmosphere was the kind that experienced royal household staff recognize immediately and respond to by becoming as invisible as their duties allow. A second insider suggested that Camilla spoke directly and frankly to members of her most trusted inner circle, expressing frustration not simply with the image itself, but with what she understood it to represent. A deliberate repositioning of the royal narrative, an attempt to begin shifting the symbolic center of the monarchy before the appropriate moment had arrived. What makes the timing so delicate is the circumstances surrounding Catherine herself. She had returned to public duties after a cancer diagnosis that had generated an outpouring of public sympathy and genuine affection from people across Britain and far beyond. The public had watched her announcement with sadness and followed her recovery with warmth that was entirely real. Any visible hostility toward Catherine in this particular window would have been not just impolitic, but genuinely damaging to Camilla's hard-built public standing. So whatever she felt privately, open confrontation was simply not an available option. The frustration had to find other channels, and according to insiders, it did. Reports suggest that members of Camilla's inner circle began making quiet but pointed inquiries into how the portrait had moved through the approval process. The questions were framed with diplomatic language, but the message behind them was clear to everyone who received them. Something had been allowed to happen that should not have happened without broader consultation. Protocols that existed for very good reasons had apparently not been followed, and those asking the questions wanted both an explanation and an assurance that the situation would not repeat itself without consequences. The inquiries were discreet. They were not discreet enough to go unnoticed by the people they were directed toward. There are also credible suggestions that the tension began affecting the coordination of royal engagements and public appearances in the weeks that followed. Inside the palace, scheduling is never purely a logistical matter. It carries meaning. Who appears at which event, in what order, receiving what level of media attention, is a constant and carefully managed dimension of how the relative standing of senior royals is communicated to the public without anyone ever saying a word about it directly. Sources say that decisions which should have been routine became complicated. Conversations that should have lasted minutes reportedly stretched into negotiations that required senior advisors to intervene before resolutions could be reached. And then there is the dimension of competing household networks. The royal family does not operate as a single unified communications machine. Each senior royal is surrounded by their own team of private secretaries and advisors, whose fundamental job is to protect and advance the interests of the person they serve. When those interests come into conflict, those networks do not stand down. They maneuver. They push their principal's narrative through trusted journalists. They time announcements for maximum effect. They find ways to respond to a provocation without leaving fingerprints on the response. According to those watching closely, All of that machinery became visibly active in the aftermath of the portrait. The palace ecosystem, normally operating in smooth and invisible coordination, had quietly divided into competing camps. And at the center of it all, one man was running out of room to keep pretending the conflict did not exist. Charles caught in the middle. There may be no more uncomfortable position anywhere in the British royal family right now than the one occupied by King Charles. He is a husband with deep obligations of loyalty to a woman who sacrificed enormously to stand beside him. He is a father figure to a daughter-in-law whose popularity and whose personal courage have made her the most beloved royal of her generation. And he is a king whose authority depends on his ability to hold a complicated institution together at a moment when the seams are showing more visibly than they have in years. Those three roles are currently pulling in directions that cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. And the portrait that started this war has forced him into the middle of it, whether he wanted to be there or not. People close to Charles describe him as fully aware of the depth of tension that has emerged since the portrait became public. He has been briefed. He understands the history and the personal dimensions that make this particular conflict so resistant to easy resolution. This is a man who has spent his entire adult life learning the hard way what happens when the balance between personal feeling and institutional duty is misjudged. He watched his first marriage collapse under the pressure of unresolved tensions that were allowed to build for too long before anyone addressed them honestly. He watched the fallout from that collapse reshape public perception of the monarchy in ways that took decades to begin healing. He carries those lessons with him, and they inform everything he does in moments like this one. But knowing the lessons of history and having a clear path forward are two very different things. On one side stands Camilla, 20 years of marriage, decades of shared history before that. A woman who endured public contempt with a quiet dignity that very few people could have sustained, and who earned her place beside him through patience that had no guaranteed outcome for a very long time. Her frustration over the portrait is not a small thing to dismiss. It is rooted in something real and something deep. To minimize her concerns, or signal publicly that her position is somehow secondary to the optics of Catherine's return, would be a betrayal she would not easily forgive or forget. On the other side stands Catherine, a decade of dedicated royal service, a health battle handled with extraordinary public grace, a level of genuine public affection that represents one of the monarchy's most valuable assets, at a time when the institution needs all the goodwill it can generate. To move against Catherine in any visible way, or to be seen endorsing any effort to diminish the impact of her portrait, would be read by the public as the palace punishing a woman for being too popular during her own recovery. The political cost of that perception would be enormous and potentially lasting. So, Charles has chosen silence. No public statement, no authorized comment from any royal source, no official explanation of how the portrait was approved, or whether the concerns raised by Camilla's camp have any official standing. The silence has been total, and it has now lasted long enough that it is no longer possible to read it as anything other than a deliberate strategy. He is hoping that time and the natural movement of the news cycle will absorb the controversy before it requires him to make a choice that damages one of the two most important relationships in his life. But silence creates vacuums, and vacuums inside an institution, as politically charged as the British monarchy, do not stay empty. They fill with competing voices and competing moves. And that, according to insiders, is precisely what has been happening while the king waits for a moment that may not come. Catherine's calculated move. The question at the center of everything is deceptively simple. Was the portrait an accident? Was the crown simply an artistic choice that moved through the approval process without anyone pausing to consider its implications? Or was Catherine and the experienced, sophisticated team that surrounds her entirely aware of what they were doing from the very first conversation with the artist to the carefully chosen moment of public release? People who have observed Catherine closely over more than a decade inside the royal family will give you a consistent answer. She does not leave important things to chance. She arrived in the institution as a young woman under immediate and relentless scrutiny, and she absorbed everything that scrutiny taught her about how power works inside the palace. She learned that in a world where direct speech is constrained by protocol and expectation, image is the most powerful language available. She learned that official portraits are not decoration. They are declarations. They hang on walls for centuries. They shape the historical record. They tell future generations who someone was and what they stood for at a specific moment in time. A woman who understands all of that does not accidentally allow a crown to appear in her official portrait. Sources connected to the Wales household have told royal correspondents that the portrait involved months of deliberate planning. The choice of artist was intentional. The setting was considered carefully. The objects within the composition were selected and placed with the full involvement of Catherine's advisory team. And the decision about when to release the image, landing during the period of peak public sympathy following her cancer journey, was not a coincidence of timing. It was a choice made by people who understood exactly what the combination of that image and that moment would communicate to the public and to the institution. One senior figure familiar with the Wales household described the portrait as a signal, not a subtle one. A clear and deliberate signal that the transition of the monarchy is not a future event to be managed at some undefined point when Charles and Camilla decide the time is right. It is already happening. It is being shaped right now, and Catherine intends to be an active and visible participant in shaping it, rather than a patient figure waiting in the wings for permission to step forward. The strategic genius of communicating through portraiture rather than through statements or interviews is that it offers no easy surface for rebuttal. A painting cannot be called into a meeting and asked to clarify its intentions. A crown in a composition cannot be summoned to explain what it meant by appearing there. Anyone who pushes back openly against the image is forced to articulate why they find it threatening, and articulating that publicly is an act of self-exposure that no shrewd royal operator would willingly perform. Camilla cannot object without confirming she feels challenged. Charles cannot intervene without visibly taking sides. The public, still emotionally invested in Catherine's recovery, will not receive criticism of this portrait sympathetically from any direction. The message was sent in the one language that cannot be cleanly answered, and everyone inside the palace who needed to receive it received it perfectly clearly. The monarchy at a crossroads. Every generation, the British monarchy arrives at a moment where the old era and the new press against each other, with a force that careful management can no longer quietly absorb. Sometimes that transition happens with grace and shared purpose. The older generation steps back with dignity. The newer generation steps forward with respect. The institution breathes through the change without losing its footing. But other times, the transition happens with friction and resistance, and the kind of internal tension that eventually finds its way into public view, despite every effort to keep it contained behind palace walls. Right now, the monarchy is living through one of those friction moments, and the portrait at the center of this story is the most visible and most telling symptom of something far larger than a disagreement over royal imagery. At its core, this is a story about two eras occupying the same institution at the same time and finding that the space between them is no longer comfortable enough to hold both without strain. Camilla represents everything that Charles built across decades of controversy, public hostility, and the slow, painful work of rehabilitation and earned acceptance. Her position was not handed to her. It was constructed piece by piece over nearly 2 decades of quiet, disciplined public service, in the face of a level of popular disapproval that would have driven most people away entirely. She does not take the symbols of that position lightly, because she understands with absolute clarity what each of them cost her to obtain. The crown she wore at the coronation in May of 2023 was not just a piece of ceremonial regalia. It was the culmination of everything she had endured to reach that moment. And she guards what it represents with the vigilance of someone who knows exactly how close she came to never receiving it at all. Catherine represents something the public has embraced, with a consistency and emotional investment that speaks entirely for itself and requires very little analysis to understand. She is the face of what the monarchy needs to become to remain genuinely relevant in the 21st century. She connects across demographics that the institution has historically struggled to reach. She carries the additional and powerful resonance of someone who faced a serious illness in public, handled every dimension of it with remarkable grace, and returned to public life, looking not diminished by the experience, but somehow strengthened and deepened by it in ways the public responded to with extraordinary warmth. Polling conducted in early 2025 confirmed what royal observers had been noting for several years. Catherine and William are the most popular members of the royal family, by a meaningful margin across virtually every measured demographic. The gap between their approval ratings and those of other senior royals is consistent and has been widening gradually. The public has made its emotional choice. It has done so clearly, and it has done so repeatedly. That reality creates a structural tension inside a constitutional monarchy that no amount of careful scheduling or diplomatic press guidance can permanently resolve or indefinitely postpone. Camilla holds her title by law, by ceremony, and by the explicit and public wish of the late Queen Elizabeth II. That is not nothing. That is everything in the formal language of the institution. But the authority that keeps a constitutional monarchy genuinely relevant and genuinely valued in modern democratic society flows ultimately from public consent and public affection. And on that particular currency, the balance has been shifting toward the next generation for years. Catherine's portrait did not create that shift, but it accelerated the conversation around it in a way that removed the remaining ambiguity and made the tension impossible to manage through silence alone. The advisors surrounding Charles lived through the 1990s. Some of them were inside the institution when the unmanaged conflicts of that decade played out in front of a watching world and left damage that took 30 years to begin repairing. They understand what happens when competing royal narratives are left without honest resolution for too long. The question that hangs over the palace right now is whether that understanding is powerful enough to produce the kind of clear and honest institutional decision-making that this moment genuinely requires. Because Catherine's portrait has opened a window, it has made visible a power struggle the palace would strongly prefer to keep behind its doors. And closing that window will require something the British monarchy has always found deeply uncomfortable: a direct and honest confrontation with the question of who leads, what the institution stands for in this precise moment, and whether the people inside it have truly learned enough from their own history to handle what is coming next with the wisdom and clarity that the future of the crown depends upon. Catherine's portrait has lit a fire inside the palace that nobody is rushing to extinguish. Camilla is watching. Charles is calculating his next move carefully, and the public has already made their choice about who their queen truly is. This story is far from over. Subscribe now, because the next chapter of this royal war is coming sooner than anyone expects.